This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. The great thing about the internet is it allows me to interview people that are dead. That's right. Through the power, the magic of technology, I can go back in time and I can interview those brilliant minds that I want to have on this show that I can't exactly get because they're 6 feet under. My guest today is one of those men, Milton Friedman. I'm going to throw out some quick questions, some quick ideas, and I'm going to let Milton elaborate. Let him answer, even though he's no longer with us. First, Professor Friedman, the free lunch myth. I want to know your perspective.
It's the free lunch myth. The belief that somehow or other government can spend money at nobody's expense. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a wonderful description of government that was made by a French economist by the name of Frédéric Bastiat about 150 years ago. He said, government is that fiction whereby everybody believes that he can live at the expense of everybody else. And that is the free lunch myth. The myth that somehow or other government can provide goods and services, can spend money at nobody's expense. Now, the particular form which that myth takes is very specific. It has two parts. One part is the belief that somehow or other you can tax business without consumers or workers or individuals paying for it. Somehow business is a big source, a big cornucopia out there that can be taxed at no cost. And the other form the myth takes is that you can create money at no cost. That if you turn the printing press, if you produce those greenbacks, that will enable people to become richer with nobody becoming poorer. Well, let me look at first problem. Can you tax business? What's business? There's no business to be taxed. There are people. Only people can pay taxes. Can I tax this floor? Can I tax the building? The building can't pay taxes. Only people can pay taxes. So when you talk about a tax on business, it has to be paid by somebody. Either it's paid by the stockholder, or it's paid by the customer, or it's paid by the worker. There's no other way it can come from. There's no Santa Claus, no tooth fairy that's going to provide a source by which the government can spend money that doesn't come from somebody. Somebody has to pay. And yet, over and over again, you hear the claim, we must not increase taxes on individuals, we'll increase taxes on business. In connection with the current discussion of Social Security, this fiction arises. There is a fiction that the Social Security tax is half on the individual and half on the employer. It's that the individual only pays 5.75%, the employer pays an equal amount. That's nonsense. That's bookkeeping. That's not economics. That's not reality. The part that the employer pays is part of his wage cost. If an employer considers whether it's worth his while to hire an additional worker, he has to consider as part of his cost not only what he pays to the worker, but also the extra taxes he will have to pay to the government. It makes no difference to the employer at all if he pays the worker a bigger check and the worker pays a larger part of that directly to the government, or he pays the worker a smaller check, but in addition has to send a check to Washington. What matters to him is the total number of dollars it costs him to hire an additional person. So the fact is, the logic is, the reason is, that the so-called tax on the employer is paid by the employee. Now, this has always been clear from economic reasoning, general economic reasoning, but it has also been subjected to empirical test. And a book even from that temple of belief in greater and bigger government, the Brookings Institution in Washington, published a couple of years ago, demonstrated empirically that the tax on the employer was really paid by the employee, that it was shifted to the employee, and it can't be any other way, as you will see if you think about it. So business doesn't pay that tax. And yet, despite this, you have the great move in Congress right now in remedying the problem of Social Security to impose a larger fraction of the tax on business on the alleged grounds that somehow or other that spares the worker. It doesn't have any such effect. It reduces the incentive to hire people and thus is imposed on the worker. But again, if you look at the taxing corporate profits, the distinction you have to draw is between who writes the check and who fundamentally bears the cost. It may well be that an official of a corporation writes the check for the tax on profits, so-called profits. He writes the check, but who pays it? He doesn't pay it. Here is a poor fellow who may be earning a modest competence. He may be writing a check for $10 million. That isn't coming out of his hide. Where's that $10 million coming from? It has to come from the proceeds of the goods and services which the enterprise sells. And that $10 million is $10 million less available either for cutting prices or for paying out dividends or for paying wages and salaries. The tax is borne by people. And for this reason, I must say, I have always myself been strongly in favor of eliminating altogether the tax on corporations. So it's open and above board that you are taxing people and that you do not conceal that fact by appearing to tax corporations. Well, again, with respect to money, can you print money at no cost? It's very cheap to turn out those pieces of paper. But does that get society something for nothing? Not at all. It's simply a different form of taxation. If you print money, people have more money to spend. If they spend more money on the same amount of goods, prices go up. And in effect, everybody is paying a tax through inflation. Once again, it's only a form of taxation.
Professor Friedman, it's not just the free lunch. It's the Robin Hood myth as well. Explain.
The myth that government has benefited the poor at the expense of the rich. That's the myth. Those are the terms on which many a governmental program is sold. What is the reality? The reality has been described in an article in the Journal of Law and Economics by my colleague George Stigler under the title of Director's Law. And Director is the name of Aaron Director, who was a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. And I might also say my brother-in-law. Director's law is that almost invariably government programs benefit the middle income class at the expense of the very poor and the very rich. Now, that may seem to you strange, but let me first explain why it makes logical sense, and second, give you some empirical evidence, starting right here at home with higher education and the state financing of higher education. On the logical level, you have a political system under which laws are passed by 51% of the people voting one way against 49% of the people. Now, the way to get a law passed, therefore, is to form a coalition covering 51% of the people. You might think that you would take the bottom 51% versus the top 49%. But the more you think about it, the more you realize that that's not a very effective way to form a coalition. Why? Because those people who are at the bottom tend to be much less skillful in political activity for the very reasons that leave them at the bottom in the economic scale. They are at the bottom in the economic scale because they have low skills or low abilities or low entrepreneurial capacities, or have been unfortunate to have been born handicapped or in groups that are discriminated against. But those same features make them relatively less effective in political activity. Who are the most effective people in political activity? Those of us in the middle classes. Where are the people who are literate? Where are the people who write for the newspapers? Where are the people who mount the hustings? Where are the people who provide the candidates? Well, you might say, why doesn't the coalition come from the top all the way down 51%? Well, the answer is that, gee, those people at the top, that's a place we can get a lot of money from. And it's worth sacrificing a few votes to get a large fraction of a tax base. And therefore, the logically most reasonable coalition is sort of 51% of the people running from the lower middle class through the upper middle class and leaving out the very rich at the top and the very poor at the bottom. Now, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the very rich are able to use their money to get an effective coalition, but most of the time that's the way it works. One of my favorite examples is state finance of higher education. This is always sold on the ground of providing opportunities to everybody in the society to get an education. But what are the facts? I doubt that there is any program financed by government in the United States which is as regressive in its impact and its financial impact as the financing of higher schooling. Who are the people who go to school? Who are the people who are attending this university? Mostly people who come from middle, upper middle, or lower middle income class families. If there are a few among you who come from lower income families, you are going to be among the middle and upper income classes. You are the richer among the poor. They are the people who go to school. They are the people who get the benefit from it. Your training here will enable you to get higher incomes than you otherwise could. Who pays for it? Well, you pay for it, and your family and friends pay for it, not through tuition. I am told your tuition covers about 15% of the cost of your schooling. The taxpayers pay for it, including the people who don't go to school. Some years ago, there was a study made for the state of California which showed that 50% of the students at state-supported institutions of higher education came from the top 25% of the income class, and 5% came from the bottom 25% of the income class. I myself am a beneficiary of state support of higher education. I went through a school that has since become a state university, Rutgers University in the state of New Jersey, on a state scholarship. Now, I think I benefited from going to the university, although I know, and I think even maybe the country at large did, although I know there are many people who disagree with that. But there's no reason why I shouldn't have paid for it. What did the poor citizens in New Jersey get? The day I graduated from college, I left New Jersey, and I've hardly ever been back since. There's a strong case to be made that everybody who wants to go to university should have an opportunity to do so, provided he's willing to pay for it. Not necessarily right now. It's highly desirable to have arrangements under which he can borrow now to pay it back later out of a higher income that his education will make possible. But there is no justification for imposing taxes on lower income people to finance the schooling of people who are or will be in the higher income groups. And yet, how much political movement is there to impose full cost tuition on colleges? There is nobody who would have a ghost of a chance of being elected to a legislature or to the state house on that program. It's the hardest thing in the world legislatively to get higher tuitions imposed. Why? Because the middle class looks after itself. Because of director's law. Now, what's true for higher education is true in every other area. Consider Social Security. Now, Social Security is also sold as a program to benefit the poor. What are the facts? Social Security is a program which imposes unduly heavy taxes on the lower income groups in the society to provide higher benefits to upper income groups in the society. How does it work? It's not because of the regressive nature of the wage tax. It's not because of the structure of benefits. It's because of a very simple phenomenon. At what age do younger men from the lower classes go to work? 16, 17, 18, 19. That's when they start to pay Social Security taxes. At what age are you people going to go to work and start paying Social Security taxes? Some of you may, in part-time jobs, have been doing so. But you will be a full-time Social Security payers only when you reach your middle 20s. So they will pay taxes for more years than you will pay taxes. Next, which one is going to receive benefits for longer? Every demographic study has shown that the average expected length of life of middle and upper income classes is longer than the average length of life of people from the lower income classes. So those poor suckers are going to pay taxes for more years and receive payments for fewer years than you and I will. Now, some of us, by virtue of continuing to work between 65 and 72, will not be in that favored class. But already, the fraction of people who work between 65 and 72 has been cut to a small part of what it used to be because of the incentive offered by Social Security. And overall, there is little doubt, therefore, that Social Security is a program which transfers income from low-income classes to high-income classes. Same thing is true of almost every other social program you can mention. I have often challenged people to find a single governmental program in which the people who pay taxes have higher incomes than those who get the benefits. I know only one, and that's direct relief, public assistance, the aid to families of dependent children. It's not a good program, it's a terrible program, it's a welfare mess. But so far as I can find out, it's the only program that demonstrably transfers income from higher income classes to lower income classes. And that's why it's such an unpopular program.
Professor Friedman, even though you are no longer with us, guess what? This socialism thing, it's not died. For some reason, everybody likes to imagine that everyone is equal regardless of effort. You have a take on socialism that might get those that think it's a great idea to think differently, because socialism is force, isn't it? Can you explain that more?
Has socialism failed because its good qualities were perverted by evil men who got in charge? Was it simply because Stalin took over from Lenin that communism went the way it did? Has capitalism succeeded despite the immoral values that pervade it? I think the answer to both questions is in the negative. The results have arisen because each system has been true to its own values. Or rather, a system doesn't have values, I don't mean that, has been true to the values it encourages, supports, and develops in the people who live under that system. What we're concerned with in discussing moral values here are those that have to do with the relations between people. It's important to distinguish between two sets of moral considerations. The morality that is relevant to each of us in our private life, how we each individually conduct ourselves, behave. And then what's relevant to systems of government and organization are the relations between people. And in judging relations between people, I do not believe that the fundamental value is to do good to others, whether they want you to or not. The fundamental value is not to do good to others as you see their good. It's not to force them to do good. As I see it, the fundamental value in relations among people is to respect the dignity and the individuality of fellow men. To treat your fellow man not as an object to be manipulated for your purpose, but to treat him as a person with his own values and his own rights. A person to be persuaded, not coerced, not forced, not bulldozed, not brainwashed. That seems to me to be a fundamental value in social relations. Whenever we depart from voluntary cooperation and try to do good by using force, the bad moral value of force triumphs over good intentions. And you realize this is highly relevant to what I am saying, because the essential notion of a capitalist society, which I'll come back to, is voluntary cooperation, voluntary exchange. The essential notion of a socialist society is fundamentally force. If the government is the master, if society is to be run from the center, what are you doing? You ultimately have to order people what to do. What is your ultimate sanction? Go back a ways. Take it on a milder level. Whenever you try to do good with somebody else's money, you are committed to using force. How can you do good with somebody else's money unless you first take it away from them? The only way you can take it away from them is by the threat of force. You have a policeman, a tax collector, who comes and takes it from them. This is carried much farther if you really have a socialist society. If you have an organization from the center, if you have supposed government bureaucrats running things, that can only ultimately rest on force. But whenever you resort to force, even to try to do good, you must not question people's motives. Maybe they're evil sometime, but look at the results of what they do. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Assume their motives are good. You know, there's an old saying about the road to hell being paved with good intentions. You have to look at the outcome. And whenever you use force, the bad moral value of force triumphs over good intentions. The reason is not only that famous aphorism of Lord Acton. You all know it, you've all heard it. Absolute power corrupts. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's the whole aphorism. That's one reason why trying to do good with methods that involve force lead to bad results. Because the people who set out with good intentions are themselves corrupted. And I may add, if they're not corrupted, they're replaced by people with bad intentions, who are more efficient at getting control of the use of force. But also, the fundamental reason is more profound. The most harm of all is done when power is in the hands of people who are absolutely persuaded of the purity of their instincts, and the purity of their intentions. Thoreau said that philanthropy is a much overrated virtue. Sincerity is also a much overrated virtue. Heaven preserve us from the sincere reformer who knows what's good for you and by heaven is going to make you do it whether you like it or not. That's when you get the greatest harm done. I have no reason to doubt that Lenin was a man whose intentions were good. Maybe they weren't. But he was completely persuaded that he was right, and he was willing to use any methods at all for the ultimate good. Again, it's interesting to contrast the experience of Hitler versus Mussolini. Mussolini was much less of a danger to human rights because he was a hypocrite. Because he didn't really believe what he was saying. He was just in there for the game. He started out as a socialist. He turned to a fascist. He was willing to be bribed by whoever would bribe him the most. As a result, there were at least some protections against his arbitrary rule. But Hitler was a sincere fanatic. He believed in what he was doing, and he did far greater harm.
Building on that, Professor Friedman, the collectivist farm, there's so many people out there today, they still just imagine that life will be a panacea. It will be great as long as they are inside a collectivist mindset, maybe even on a farm. I mean, some of these people really want to be alongside each other, earning the same pennies per hour, doing the exact same task, and after 50 or 60 years of that, they die. Collectivism, oh, what a dream. I believe you have some views on that, Professor Friedman, and I would love for you to elaborate.
What is it that produces this consistent attitude of anti-capitalism on the one hand and pro-something called collectivism on the other among intellectuals? One of the most interesting analyses of these problems I know is by a Russian dissident mathematician named Shafarevich. His essay, which has never been published, needless to say, in Russia, but it appears in English translation in a book called Under the Rubble, which has been edited by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I strongly recommend that particular paper to you. In it, he discusses the appeal of socialism over the ages. He goes back 1,000 or 2,000 years. And he comes out with the conclusion that just as Freud pointed to the death wish in individuals as a fundamental psychological propensity, the appeal of capitalism, he argued, the appeal of socialism in the opposition to capitalism is really a fundamental sign of a death wish for society on the part of intellectuals. It's a very intriguing, strange, and at first sight, highly improbable kind of an interpretation. Yet I urge you all to read that essay because you will find that it is very disturbing by having a great deal more sense to it than you would suppose such a position could possibly have. I'm not going to take that line. Maybe he's right, but I think there's a very much simpler analysis, a simpler reason for this. And that simpler reason is a combination of a supposed emphasis on moral values and ignorance and misunderstanding about the relationship between moral values and economic systems. I may say the emphasis on moral values is almost always on the part of people who do not have economic problems. It's not on the part of the masses. But the problem with this approach, the problem of trying to interpret and analyze a system, either pro or con, in terms of such concepts as the morality of the system or the humanity of the system, whether capitalism is humane or socialism is humane, or moral or immoral. The problem with that is that moral values are individual. They are not collective. Moral values have to do with what each of us separately believes and holds true, what our own individual values are. Capitalism, socialism, central planning are means, not ends. They, in and of themselves, are neither moral nor immoral, humane nor inhumane. We have to ask, what are their results? We have to look at what are the consequences of adopting one or another system of organization. And from that point of view, the crucial thing is to look beneath the surface. Don't look at what the proponents of one system or another say are their intentions, but look at what the actual results are. Socialism, which means government ownership and operation of means of production, has appealed to high-minded, fine people, to people of idealistic views, because of the supposed objectives of socialism, especially because of the supposed objectives of equality and social justice. Now, those are fine objectives. And it's a tribute to the people of good will that those objectives should appeal to them. But you have to ask the question, does the system, no matter what its proponents say, produce those results? And once you look at the results, it's crystal clear that they do not. Where are social injustices greatest? Social injustices are clearly greatest where you have central control. The degree of social injustice and torture in a place like, and incarceration in a place like Russia is of a different order of magnitude than it is in those Western countries where most of us have grown up and in which we have been accustomed to regarding freedom as our natural heritage. Where do you have the greatest degree of inequality? In the socialist states of the world. I remember about 15 years ago, my wife and I were in Russia for a couple of weeks. We were in Moscow. And we were going with our tourist guide and I happened to see some of the fancy Russian limousines up there, the Zivs. They were sort of a takeoff on the 1938 American Packards. And I asked our tourist guide out of amusement, how much do those sell for? Oh, she said, those aren't for sale. Those are only for the members of the Politburo. You have in a country like Soviet Union enormous inequality in the immediate literal sense that there is a small select group that has all of the services and amenities of life and very large masses that are on a very, very low standard of living. Indeed, in a more direct way, if you take the wage rate of foremen versus the wage rate of ordinary workers in the Soviet Union, the ratio is much greater than it is in the United States. On this same trip that we took to Russia, we stopped in Poland, in Warsaw for a while, and we met there a marvelous man, a man by the name of Edward Lipinski, who was in this country a year ago at the age of 83 or 4. I believe was arrested when he got back to Poland because he had been one of those who had signed and authored a declaration against the suppression of freedom of thought and speech in Poland. But at the time we met Edward Lipinski, he seemed to be fairly free. He was a man who had been a socialist all his life. And this was really very hard he was now in his 70s, I may say. When we saw him, he was retired. Very hard thing for a man to go back on all of his lifelong beliefs. And so he said as follows to us. He said, I used to believe in socialism. I still do. But socialism is an ideal. We can't have it in the real world, he said, until we're rich enough to be able to afford it. And he said, socialism will be practical when every man in Poland has a house and 2 servants. And I said to him, including the servants? And he said, yes. Capitalism, on the other hand, is a system of organization that relies on private property and voluntary exchange. It has repelled people. It's driven them away from supporting it because they have thought it emphasized self-interest in a narrow way, because they were repelled by the idea of people pursuing their own interest rather than some broader interest. Yet if you look at the results, it's clear that the results go the other way around. If you look, you will find that freedom has prevailed where you've had capitalism, and that simultaneously so has the well-being and the prosperity of the ordinary man. There's been more social justice and less inequality.
I have one more question, Professor. One more question. Especially in 2015, 16, coming into 17, there's this political debate. It's not a new one. When you were alive, you discussed it. But the case against equal pay for equal work, it sounds so good. There is this army of people hiring that will pay men or some other niche group, will pay them more than another person who supposedly, because of their either race or their sex or their gender, is paid less. Professor, the floor is yours.
Equal pay for equal work laws are a source of apartheid. The basic source of apartheid in South Africa was the insistence by trade unions on equal pay for equal work. The women who go around today urging equal pay for equal work are being anti-feminist. They don't intend to be, but that is the effect of their policy. Because if there is any activity in which, for any reason, a male is preferable to a female, or vice versa, the only weapon the less productive sex has is to offer to work for less. And if you deny them that opportunity, you're assuring yourself that you're going to have all male jobs or all female jobs, all white jobs or all black jobs.
But aren't you also condemning them to stay that way?
Not at all. Not at all. The typical course, if you go back to American history, by taking these low-paid jobs, a great many people, not all, but a great many people were able to develop skills and activities, accumulate a little skill, a little capital, a little knowledge, improve their lot, become advance in the stage, get to a higher level of productivity, and get a higher income. That's been the typical way up the ladder for most of the people who came in here. It was a way up the ladder for my parents, for your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, I don't know which. And that's the way in which, unfortunately, there's no way in which you can immediately propel people to the top of the ladder.
Mr. Friedman, referring to the statements that you made about women who advocate equal pay for equal work.
Gee, I thought I'd get a rise out of that sooner or later. Delighted to have it.
Yes, okay, I just would like to know if you're insinuating or perhaps, point blankly saying that women and other minorities' skills are inferior to those of those now holding those jobs, and that they need to go through a period where their skills need to be improved and therefore deserve to be paid less?
No, I don't think desert has anything to do with it. I'm not. First of all, I think desert is an impossible thing to decide. Who deserves what? Nobody deserves anything. Thank God we don't get what we deserve. But I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying a very different thing. I'm saying that the actual effect of requiring equal pay for equal work will be to harm women. If women's skills are higher than men's in a particular job and are recognized to be higher, the law does no good. Because then they will be able to compete away and can get the same income. If their skills are less for whatever reason, maybe it isn't because it's their sex, maybe it's because they were out of the labor force, maybe it's for other reasons, and you say the only way you are able to hire them is by paying the same wage, then you're denying them the only weapon they have to fight with. If the unwillingness of the men to hire them is because the men are sexist, what's the phrase, racist, sexist pigs or whatever, if that's the only reason they want to hire them, nonetheless, you want to make it costly to them to exercise their prejudice. If you say to them, you have to pay the same wage no matter whether you hire women or men, then here's Mr. Sexist Pig. It doesn't cost him anything to hire men instead of women. However, if the women are free to compete and to say, well, now look, I'll offer my work for less, then he can only hire men if he bears a cost. If the women are really good as good as a man, then he's paying a price for discriminating. And what you are doing, not intentionally, but by misunderstanding, when you try to get equal pay for equal work laws, is what you are doing is reducing to zero the cost imposed on people who are discriminating for irrelevant reasons. And I would like to see a cost imposed on them. I'm on your side, but you're not.
Professor, I want to thank you once again for coming back to assist us from the grave to give those fantastic insights. Because even though people love to, at least some people love to imagine all of these things, this collectivism, the socialism, these other constructs of where government can be the savior, so many really think this is the path. But what's great is the answer, the contradiction, the counter to all of this is timeless. And that's why I wanted to talk to you today. That's why I wanted your insights today. Now, I hope my audience doesn't think I've gone completely crazy with this idea today, but I sort of like it. After 4 years of doing this podcast, I like the idea of taking all of these great insights from minds that are no longer with us and putting it out there today. Because yes, while Milton Friedman was not perfect, that man was super, super smart, super rational, super logical. He tears apart issues in a way that we can all digest, that we can all understand. And for that, I am forever grateful. One more thought before we go. I want your feedback. I want your feedback about this podcast, my trend following world, guest ideas, anything you want to pass along. I want to know. Give me your advice. Give me your opinion. Give me your insights. I'm easy to reach. Michael@covel.com. That's my first name at my last name.com. Covel, that's one L. Drop me a line and I promise to get back in touch with each and every one of you personally. No automated responses coming from me, just little old me. And going out, again, I want to thank Milton Friedman for his appearance on my show today. Even though he wasn't exactly here in the flesh, in the here and now, alive. But his thoughts, his wisdom, that never dies. Timeless personified. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.